Constitution after the Civil War, those were both arguments for racial equality. Racism was sin, and African Americans had civil and political rights. They were supposed to have equal protection under the law. Supposed to being the maybe dominant thing there. And for white Southerners who had so invested in every theological sort of denomination with the idea that slavery wasn't just acceptable, but that it had been divinely ordained. It was the better reading of the Bible. They were not interested in getting rid of those ideas after emancipation. They would time and again say, well, that ship has sailed politically, or this is no longer popular, but, and then they would repeat their same antebellum arguments. It was hard to imagine they really were reading the same Bible. They certainly were not reading and talking about the same themes.
Yeah, and you, of course, titled your book Christian Citizens. And citizens can be such a loaded thing, both politically and theologically, a loaded term. And I was really struck by that. And I think, citizens implies, and we're dealing with that now with immigration and a lot of other issues, that some are as citizens, some are not. And theologically, I think that has been done maybe in a harsh way in a lot of circles. That word is fraught with a lot of different things going on, but I'm curious why you picked that as your title and a theme of your whole look at this subject.
Yeah, so we think of citizens, it often involves the people who belong, those who have rights, who can expect certain types of treatment and maybe prevention from other types of treatment, and who have certain responsibilities in a given community. And citizenship itself as a legal category was changing in this time. So it was the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, not to just sound like a history professor, but it was ratified in 1868, and it was the origin of our current concept of birthright citizenship, that being born in this country makes you a citizen. And the reason it was necessary was because the Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, and right before the Civil War, had said that no one of African descent was a citizen. No one of African descent was legally allowed to sue in court, to demand any rights under the US Constitution. So the need to correct that was really essential. So there's a changing legal category, but there's also a changing set of arguments around what citizenship meant. Some women tried to argue that they had the right to vote because they were citizens, and most states said, no, right? And so to think about what Christian citizenship meant for different people was really important for me, because for white Southerners, it often meant a certain sense of decorum, holding your place in a hierarchical society, being content there. It was sort of about civility sometimes, when applied to others. They didn't always hold themselves to the same standard. And the ways that African Americans said, no, look, we are citizens. We are fellow Christians with you white Southerners, and we are fellow citizens who have rights. These are two arguments you must not ignore if you claim to take the Bible seriously.
And being from a small town in South Mississippi, Monticello, I grew up around a lot of, would occasionally go to black churches, and people would, in black churches, would take pride in the fact that they held offices. They would introduce them. I'm the historian, I'm the whatever. And you could kind of see between the lines that this is maybe the only place I get that respect of holding an office, or because I'm outward in society that's white controlled, I don't have that. Now I'm just historically just thinking of the black church offering some avenue for a feeling of citizenship where people may not feel it otherwise.
Yes, African American churches serve so many different roles, right? If you had, before the Civil War, they were mostly outlawed. Only very few states that had slavery had actual recognized African American churches. But almost overnight after emancipation, African Americans built churches. So you would sometimes have a Freedmen's Bureau official, someone coming in from the north saying, I've come here to help. Oh, this community already has built their own church, and they're holding a school in the church. And what they'd like would be some books for the library for the school, and maybe a teacher who can come more regularly. So African American communities organized their own churches. To the great shock of white Protestants who had segregated balconies built and thought, well, we have the right message. Why are they not wanting to hear it? But African American churches grew exponentially in these decades right after the Civil War. And the churches themselves, those buildings, they served as schools, day schools, night schools. Every time you could have a school, they're happening there. They had political rallies there. They had politicians come and speak because there was nowhere else where African Americans could gather freely. If you had a town hall, that was white controlled. The courthouse was certainly white controlled. Other civic spaces just were not available. And so African American churches were their counter-public space, sort of public gathering space for African American communities.
And what's interesting in your book, too, is you point out that there were differences in some of the black denominations that emerged, the African Methodist Episcopal and the colored Methodist Episcopal, for instance. And you talk about that even that story is more nuanced than it was thought of at the time, that the colored Methodist Episcopal were seen as more collaborators with the white community, whereas the African Methodist Episcopal were seen as more being willing to be a little more confrontational or more political. But you spent a lot of time, you told me, in CME with their archives and learned that their story was more nuanced than you thought. And just what was that experience like in researching those two denominations and what was going on there?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wanted to do was to offer some range of the experience on both sides, right? To not just paint there's one African American Christian perspective, because there's not. And so to think about how can I get the sources? So the CME, which is since the 1950s been the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, they have their headquarters in Memphis. And so I had several opportunities to keep going back and saying, I'd really love to get in your archives. Please, I'd be so polite. Thank you. I wrote a lot of thank you notes. And at the same time, I wanted to make the case that this was not a group worth dismissing. The AME Church is larger. National Baptist Convention wasn't formed at this point, but there were a lot of African American Baptist churches. And so for me, it was important to see how can I get into the archives themselves to see what I can find there. How can I record people's own words rather than relying on what people said about them, both in those times and in ours.
Yeah. And it was interesting too, in terms of the white churches, you really probed kind of some of the tenets, what they claimed to be the tenets of pro-slavery theology, how they drew on some biblical sources. Suppose Jesus never said slavery was a sin was one of their thoughts, that there are some slaves obey your masters text in the Bible, and a lot of comparisons of kind of the slavery relationship with the marriage relationship. But tell us about some of those tenets that were preached of pro-slavery theology by the white churches.
Yes. I teach this with my students every semester. And I always pick South Carolinian pro-slavery authors. Not that all my students are from South Carolina. I have a Baptist for one class and a Presbyterian for a different class, because there's so many of these available sources from which I could choose. But the basic argument that pro-slavery theologians had was that they were taking the Bible more seriously. They were the ones who were holding fast to the text in the face of all these new cultural ideas, which for them were coming from the Enlightenment. They said it's the French Revolution, it's these inalienable rights. Inalienable rights are not in the Bible, they would say, which is true. And they were mostly arguing with white anti-slavery voices who were much more moderate and much less willing to condemn racism than they were slavery. Most white anti-slavery arguments did not use the Bible quite as well because the Bible's a pretty good source for arguing against racial privilege, racial hierarchy. Black abolitionists knew it. They would say, well, look at Acts chapter 10, where Peter has a vision of unclean and clean animals, and he learns there shouldn't be divisions in the new Jewish Christian followers of Jesus between the Jews and the Gentiles. That all should be welcomed in this new Jesus movement. And David Walker says, that's what you're doing. Do you think God is partial? And he had these great quotes of the King James Bible. David Walker was a black abolitionist writing in Boston in 1829, so not from a slave state, he'd been a free man his whole life. But white anti-slavery folks didn't make that case. And so that left an opening for the pro-slavery side to say, we're the ones taking the Bible seriously because there are 4 places in the different epistles that say slaves obey your masters. And there is no point in the Gospels where Jesus says slavery is a sin. And slavery existed in the Roman Empire. Slavery existed in the ancient Near East, where the Old Testament comes from. And they would further build out their argument about God's support of hierarchy. They say God is a God of order. Not only has the Bible commanded in 4 places in the New Testament for slaves to obey their masters, but each one of those is paired a few verses before or after with an argument that says, wives, obey your husbands. And many times there's also a children, obey your parents. And so they said, we're taking the Bible more seriously because we understand that equal rights do not have any place in the Bible. Instead, the Bible prescribes duties, responsibilities, hierarchy. And they would argue that they were the ones who had the right biblical perspective. They used it to justify denominational splits, creating the Southern Baptist Convention, which still exists today, the Southern Methodist, which existed until almost 1940, and the Southern Presbyterians that existed until the early 1980s. The 1980s, not the 1880s. The Episcopalians are a little bit different. They managed to get right back together after the Civil War. But those divisions really shaped the South because they argued that we're the Southern Methodists or the Southern Presbyterians, and we're the ones taking the Bible seriously. Our Northern counterparts are barely even Christian. Maybe they're not even Christians. And so it enabled people to feel like they were the ones on their sort of theological high horse. They were the serious ones. And it enabled them to justify disenfranchisement, segregation, but also all manner of extra-legal violence, lynching, other forms of white supremacist terrorism.
And your book really uncovers some of the things I did not know about. I live very close to Clinton, Mississippi, near Jackson. In fact, my nephew goes to college now at Mississippi College, a great Baptist school there. And I had no idea that it was the site of one of the most brutal massacres. You referred to the Clinton massacre in the 1870s or so?
1875, yeah.
Right. Tell us about that. Tell us the story behind that and how that may have shaped what was coming with the 1890 Constitution.
Yes, so the 1890 Constitution was not out of nowhere. That was the legal encoding of the white supremacist practices that had already been in effect. And so 1875 was still ostensibly during Reconstruction. They were still theoretically supposed to be federal government protections for black civil and political rights. And the governor of Mississippi, knowing that the elections were coming, that governor was a white man who'd served in the Union Army, he wrote to President Grant and said, we need troops because black voters are not going to be safe. He did not get troops. Grant was done with Reconstruction, basically. And so in Clinton, Mississippi, you had a gathering of a large number of black voters. They were all gathering in a Republican rally. Right? The Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. It's a little different than how later political affiliations worked out. But in their gathering, a few liquored up young white men came, and one of them, at some point, pulled out a pistol and theoretically accidentally fired into the crowd. And a sort of massive skirmish ensues. Many African Americans were killed and 3 white men were killed. They were the ones who'd shown up drunk and armed to the gathering. And in the days that followed, white mobs just went through the countryside. They were doing all sorts of just terroristic violence. And I use the word terrorism because the violence was meant to inspire fear in others. It was not just a matter of harming an individual who was experiencing violence. It was about terrorizing a community. And that came a couple months, it was September, so it's 2 months before the election of that year. And that's not the only thing that happened in the lead up to that election. But then when the election rolls around, businesses were saying, we will deny you credit to African Americans if you vote Republican. Vote Democrat or don't vote. And so the Democrats swept the state elections, dramatically changing what had been happening even 2 years before. And white clergy rejoiced across denominational lines. So a devout Calvinist on the east side of Mississippi, outside of Tupelo, wrote, we'll finally have a good legislature. Over in Port Gibson, just outside of Natchez, an old Methodist, revered former itinerant preacher. Those were the really serious Methodists, the ones who'd been itinerants. He gets up in his pulpit the next Sunday and he says, "Let us give thanks to God for our victory in our election." And then he goes through to outline how it had been a whole year of planning, but especially a lot of extra work in the last 6 weeks. And to outline how we should rejoice, we being, of course, his white congregation, should rejoice in our victory, whether it's by God's hand or by our own work. And you see people who had theological differences, right? The Calvinist guy outside of Tupelo, he spent his evenings reading why the Methodists are wrong, and the Methodists spent all of his time defending free will. But that didn't matter when it came to supporting a white supremacist Christian orthodoxy.
Yeah, and you talked about in the 1890 Constitution, actually, they would break in for people to go and do prayer meetings to pray for the adoption of the Constitution and the statutes embedded within it.
Yes, they did that. So when the Mississippi State Constitutional Convention met in Jackson, everyone knew that they were coming together to figure out how to rewrite their state constitution to disenfranchise black voters by means other than race, because they had to list something other than race. And they spent weeks doing this. The opening prayer was given by a very revered Methodist bishop, seen as often a moderate on issues of race. And every morning, a clergyman would come in and open the gathering in prayer. They'd be the Episcopalian one day and a Presbyterian the next. And they thought about all different ways to try to use different means within their power to disenfranchise black voters. At one point, they even considered enfranchising the wives of wealthy white men. Then they decided they didn't want to go that route. But they were really trying to be creative in their own way to figure out how they were going to go about this. And they came up with ideas that we all know about now because they worked and they lasted. Poll taxes, literacy tests that could be judged incredibly unfairly, grandfather clauses, all of these methods that we know about because the Voting Rights Act of 1965, coming out of tremendous, brave activism in the civil rights movement, specifically had to undo those things. And so when they were coming up with the final calculation of what they were going to do, they stopped for a day of prayer, and they sent everyone. All but one of these delegates were white men. There was one African-American man there. They sent them all out into the churches in Jackson to go have a day of prayer to ask for God's blessing, and then they came back together and put it all together and ratified it. So they were really convinced that what they were doing was creating a better society. And better was very partial. And they were proud of it. As I'll mention tomorrow, my double great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, was the youngest member of this delegation. I've been through the journal and all of the hundreds of pages. He did almost nothing. I mean, he voted yes and no on various things. But since he was the youngest, he outlived everybody else. And 45 years later, in the commercial appeal, he bragged about his role, which he massively overstated what he'd actually done. He claimed that he'd been basically more successfully white supremacist than anyone else had been, that he was responsible for certain ideas. And he wasn't. It's very clear that he was not. But that was something where people were so proud of, that they would outdo each other in their white supremacy. I think it's really telling because I think it shows how recently the most overt, sort of infamous to historians, infamous to civil rights activists, right? The Mississippi was the hardest place for the civil rights movement. Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964 was the bloodiest, most violent part of the civil rights movement. Mississippi Burning is a great film to see if you haven't. That's all because it was supported as morally acceptable by white Christians. It was Christian orthodoxy. It was making a better Christian society.
Yeah, and I think, coming to terms with our own family histories. In my case, my grandfather, who I dearly loved, once told me the story. He said, there was a lynching that happened one time, or the hanging of a black man from a tree, and I was asked to take part in that, and I refused. I said, I'm having no part of it. And you know, years ago, I felt proud of. Well, my grandfather at least was not actively engaged in it, but now I wonder, why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you do something to actually stop this happening? And I think, you know, this engagement with our family history, it can really shake you. I wonder what impact that's had on you, just knowing a little more of your family's story and how that may shape you in some way.
I'm sure there are some people who begin to uncover their family histories and they get in trouble for talking about it around the dinner table, but I didn't grow up in one of those families. I'm very fortunate. I think that part of what's often been helpful for me is to talk about these things with friends and family, right? They're the academic friends I have who can help me with my footnotes and my secondary sources and all of those things. But often to say, like, goodness, how do we live? I was talking to Laura Geddes about this from Grace St. Luke's a few years ago, and we were just the two of us were chatting, and we said, so, you know, she was asking me, when do you start looking around Memphis and just saying, wow, how did this come to be the way that it is? And I think for me, in the process of the book and the dissertation that preceded it, there was a lot of, I knew it was bad, but goodness, it's worse than I thought. And I've been reading this stuff for years. So I think it shapes a lot of how we think, right? There isn't a morally pure option. There isn't, in my mind, much use in celebrating good white people as somehow exceptional or separate from the white supremacist sea in which they were swimming. Absolutely, some people made better choices than others, and making good choices is crucial. But to presume that, you know, because we loved our grandparents, they made good choices, or because they were kind to us, they weren't involved in all of these things, is sort of like saying today that because I love my children, I'm not engaged in who knows what, that they might want to come back to me, or their children maybe someday would come back and say, how could you have done this in that time? It's the human condition.
Yeah, absolutely. We could all be asked about that related to the environment, for sure. And but yeah, and I think that's where the critical empathy comes in too. Looking back, maybe putting myself in my grandfather's shoes of what he was facing that time. At that time, maybe I'd still look at his story differently or more nuanced in exploring that. Well, two women whose stories that were very prominent in your book are Charlotte Hawkins Brown and Kate Foster. I wonder if you'd tell us about their two stories, the contrast between those two women. I thought was really, really incredible.
Yes. So I'll start with Kate Foster, because she lived a little earlier. She was a white woman in Natchez, Mississippi. She lived in a very prominent slaveholding family in the years before the Civil War. Both her brothers would go fight for the Confederacy. And as Natchez was Union occupied, she was keeping a diary because she was sure this was just a challenge and God would vindicate the Confederacy. So she was recording what was happening, and she talked about going into her church on a Sunday right after the Union troops had shown up. And there were a few Union officers in uniform, Union soldiers in uniform in the church. And on that Sunday, an African-American man walked, she said he was wearing his Sunday clothes, walked up to the front in the church and demanded a seat. And she was aghast. And he stood there, sort of asserting his freedom, saying, I belong down here, not up there. You don't have a balcony, but I'm pointing to an imaginary balcony. And there, eventually, he was basically forced to go up. But he was asserting his freedom, and she was horrified. And so she would write in her diary, you know, that she was sure God was going to vindicate the Confederacy because they were the ones defending the right. And of course, she was worried about her brother's safety. They would both be killed over the course of the Civil War. And in the years after, her family would face very reverse financial situations. But yet, even in her later years, in the 1890s, she and a sister were very involved in the United Daughters of the Confederacy to create monuments to their past glory. A very different woman is Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who was an African-American educator I'll mention her tomorrow too, I think. And she ran a school for African Americans in the early part of the 20th century in North Carolina, close to Greensboro. And she came to what was a really remarkable gathering in Memphis in 1920, organized at the YMCA building on Madison by very progressive white women. Most of them were Methodists. The Methodists were at the forefront of kind of doing good stuff along those lines. They were working to educate other white women on race. And they had a really radical idea, was to actually listen to African American women. Just a few of them. And they mostly had white speakers. But Charlotte Hawkins Brown came and she basically said, how dare you call yourselves Christians? What are you doing? She said the crimes of lynching are horrendous, and if you white women would do something about it, it could stop. It would take them a long time. About a decade later, some of the same women in that room would help start the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, where they did basically say, we as white women want you to know we do not want you to do this in our name. This is cruel. We are now voters, so you sheriffs, if you allow this to happen, we will vote you out of office. And they did try to stop lynchings when they could. But it was because of the courage of women like Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and then the fact that she kept pushing them when they didn't do anything, and then they still didn't do anything, and then they kept not doing anything, and they would ask her and her friends for position papers and what they should do, and they would formulate them, and then the white woman would still ignore them. But eventually, she was able to push them to take more important action. And for both of these women, what the Christian response was a crucial part of how they thought about how they should live. But what the Christian response was diametrically opposed. And I see that over and over again.
Yeah, and it was interesting too that there seemed to be lynchings that seemed to, a lot of the fear that was around was it was over sexuality, over the possible rape of white women. That was the myth.
That was the myth, right? But ever since 1892, when Ida B. Wells here in Memphis knew about the People's Grocery, where her friend Thomas Moss and his two business partners were killed, she said, this is a lie. Yeah. She counted lynchings, and she said, not even in a third of cases is there an allegation. She said, this is a white supremacist lie. And she was right, and she was run out of Memphis. And she lived the rest of her life in Chicago because that truth was really dangerous to say.
Right, as I understand People's Grocery, it was a small grocery store, African-American owned, that the competitors didn't like. And the lynching was really, that was a motivation, apparently.
It was the motivation, yeah. Thomas Moss was a married man with a young child. He was a father starting a business. Wow. And that cost him his life.
Well, I want to bring history to today, well, obviously you live and teach in South Carolina, a state that has wrestled with issues over the Confederate flag in recent years, and monuments, in which have wrestled with here in this city, and we're now wrestling with here on our block, where we've discovered that slaves were once bought and sold just in a stone's throw of where we are right now. And we're grappling with that in our building program, and I think you've given us some advice, and others have. But as you think about people, not just our church, as we're looking at ways to tell our history truly and truly honor all those, the whole story, the real story that was involved, and maybe our city as well as South Carolina, how do we endeavor to do that? And I wanted to, you told about a conversation between a white student who talked about how meaningful the Confederate flag had been to her, I think in 2016, and how a black student told their story and how that may have reshaped an opinion there.
Yes, I know what story from one of my classes you're talking about. Yeah. That was a lot of questions. How do we fix today?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I think we start by trying to be honest, like actually honest. And not just honest about what happened at the time. So what happened? What did Nathan Bedford Forrest do? Steps from here. But also honest about why it was in the interest of the white power structure to do very different things with Nathan Bedford Forrest's history. To disinter him and his wife in 1905 from Elmwood Cemetery and put them at what's now the Medical Park. Is that still the name? Health Science Park. Thank you. I haven't lived in Memphis. I get rusty on these details, right? To disinter him and to build a statue in 1905 when these Jim Crow laws are being created. What happened in 1955 when the original marker went out there? the year after Brown versus Board of Education, as white massive resistance is growing. These aren't accidents. So how can we be honest about the history of what happened and the history of that history? Our word as historians for that is historiography, but really it's just whose interest was served by the lies that have been told. And I think we have to do that in community. I mean, I think classrooms are an amazing place. I see more of my former teachers out here. But I love teaching because there you get to see people encounter new ideas and it can change their mind. Right? We all encounter new ideas sometimes, but often if we're over the age of 22, it's more likely for us to find a way to dismiss it or compartmentalize it or say, well, it's different in that case. But sometimes, particularly for people who are young adults, maybe teenagers too, they're willing to think about things differently. So I did have a case, my first year teaching at Clemson. So it's the year after the Emanuel 9 shooting in Charleston at Mother Emanuel Church, where 9 people were shot by a white supremacist. It's the year after the Confederate flag had come down outside the State House. And there were student protests on my campus because the very first embarrassingly modest efforts at Clemson to discuss African American history. I have a colleague, Rhonda Thomas, who was a one-woman champion of African American history for years, and only once she got a lot of national grants did the university start to value her. There had been sort of major resistance to this African American history on campus and sparked student protests. So as the protests were happening, I was teaching a class on religion in the South, which I told my students was not going to be Southern Baptist through time. And so in this class, this is like April, so we kind of knew each other by that point. The class turned to talk about what was happening a few buildings away where the students were having a sit-in at the major administrative building on campus. And a white student from a nearby town, I live in the particularly red corner of the state, politically, she said, well, her family had always used the Confederate flag in ways that weren't racist. I saw some hands go up real quickly. And so I called on an African American woman. And she turned, and she didn't look at me. She looked at the student over there. And she said, well, that's because no one was trying to lynch people who looked like you. I said, And we kind of let that lie for a minute. And then other students gathered in. And by this point, I knew who in the class wanted to engage with these issues. And the white girl was not happy, but she was listening. And towards the end of the class, she spoke up again, and she was feeling a little emotional. She was almost sort of looking like she was on the verge of tears, and she said, it is really hard to think that what you were raised with might be wrong. And I said, yeah.
Wow.
But that's what teaching gives people the chance to do. That's what young people give a chance to do. I am no longer young. But my students help remind me that there is the ability to change our minds. It's always available to us. And when we confront new ideas and can learn new histories, confront new ideas and have the courage to say, whew, what if what I've always thought is wrong? Whoa, that's hard. And to acknowledge how hard that is, at the same time, not to let that discourage us from doing that hard work.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, too, about your next project. It's focused on motherhood, both literally and scholarly. And tell us about that, why you're drawn to that subject and the time period that you're looking at and how that may be an extension of what you've been doing before.
Yes. So the truth is that I really want to write 2 books right now, and only one of them is about motherhood. But as I'm also mothering a lot, neither book is getting a whole lot of attention. But the book about motherhood is really looking at how women in the early part of the 20th century, during the years of segregation, when they were able to come together across racial lines in imperfect, lopsided ways, it was often because they could see in each other a shared Christian womanhood or a shared Christian motherhood. Now, it was very partial. It's deeply imperfect. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, I was referring to earlier, was part of that process. She was not herself a mother, but that calling to account of white women was an important part of that process. And so I'm really interested in seeing how Christian motherhood, Christian womanhood, could be a category that people could imagine women very unlike themselves belonging to, and then what that meant. So what did it mean when really fascinating white Methodist woman, sort of leader in their home mission movement. She said she would tell women at that same gathering where Charlotte Hawkins Brown was, she said, go home and figure out and tell other white women to ask, what are your cook's children doing during the day? Because the assumption was they all had African American women working in their homes. And say, what are they doing? Where are they? Who is watching them? Are they safe? And then try to think about what you might do with that answer. Because this woman lived in Kentucky, this white woman, and she would say, well, look, children are crossing a railroad crossing. It is not safe. Children have nowhere to go. It is not safe. So she wasn't saying don't employ women in your home. She was saying figure out how to have safe childcare for them. And that was 1920. We still haven't figured out childcare today, right? We still haven't figured out where elementary school children are supposed to go in the summer, right? What all these things that shape children's lives. And in 1920, when women were able to think about that, it was because of a sense of recognizing in each other, oh, you're another Christian mother. You're another Christian woman. So I want to see what was possible in those times. And also to note where, as happens today, I mean, my own motherhood, I'm sure, is a great example of that, where women with, particularly white women with privilege, experience motherhood in vastly different ways. You know, I worry about getting this child on my daycare's infant wait list. And, you know, don't worry, he's on. The daycare says you got to tell us before you tell your mother. So I've taken note. That's not a joke.
No, I understand that.
And yet that's my challenge. My challenge is not how am I going to pay for it? How am I going to stay employed and not get fired? How am I going to have any kind of leave after I give birth? A quarter of American women today go back to work 2 weeks after they give birth. And we wonder why we have an infant mortality rate that is embarrassing, a child mortality rate, a maternal mortality rate that is unlike the rest of the developed world. Right? My challenges are not the challenges of average American mothers. And so I think about that a lot as I work on this book.
Well, I think bringing that to today, motherhood, obviously, I think about in some of the major issues we're facing, gun violence here in this city and around the country. Moms Demand Action Against Gun Violence is probably the most active group, at least I've encountered here in this city and around, that's working on that. In the Israel-Palestine situation, just days before Israeli and Palestinian mothers marched together and actually did a quilt together, did a peace prayers together. And you think of the force of motherhood, not only what it could have been maybe in those days, and maybe there were some seeds planted to do that, but the possibilities today for that. So we'll look forward to your new book and this project. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Katie to go around and see if there are questions from you. Elizabeth would love to hear some questions from you.
Okay.
Paul mentioned that his grandfather knew of a lynching and he thought, well, maybe he could have prevented it. My grandfather had a similar situation. And I just wondered if you came across any white people in the Reconstruction or early 20th century who actually did do something about it.
Yes. Not as many as you would like to find. I'll give two examples. So one is a Northern Methodist minister who came as a chaplain into Mississippi right after the Civil War. He was asked by the majority Republican legislature, so a lot of African Americans in the legislature of Mississippi, to give an address on the occasion of their Reconstruction Constitution, the previous Constitution that had allowed for black voters. And he preached and said, look, prejudice is sinful. Things need to change, and specifically cited violence around those issues. But in terms of stopping lynching, right, probably people in this room may know that there was never like major federal anti-lynching legislation. But in the South in the 1930s, so almost 40 years, about 40 years after Ida B. Wells here was decrying lynching and exposing it, you did have this group, the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, which is a long name. They were started by a woman named Jessie Daniel Ames. And the classic book on this was written in the 1970s called Revolt Against Chivalry. And those women were organized. They knew what they were doing, and they were very clear about using their power to prevent lynchings and to enforce consequences for white elected officials when they happened. So lynchings were public, right? They were publicized. And so those women would get on the telegraph. They'd get involved in their local communities, and they would say, like, this is about to happen. We need the sheriff to know that we know, and we need the sheriff to stop it. Or we need some other official to stop this. And we need to impose consequences for those who are involved with this. They were successful in some cases in trying to push that, and they were very much doing that on a local level. So they had state organizations, and they had local affiliations that trying to do that work. So there are a few examples. They're not a lot.
Other questions? Yes, Susan?
I appreciated your take on, I think you said it was historiography.
Yes, historiography.
Historiography, and like one of them that really stands out to me is when we drive over to East Tennessee and you see all the Confederate flags, and I'm thinking, you guys were in the state of Franklin, you went with the North. And I'm just like interested in like your take on the ones that we see right now and any thoughts you have, like that one, for example.
You mean my take on the things that seem so counter to the historical origins of the...
Like, and we see a lot of it right now, I think, especially, like other examples.
Right. I mean, the Confederate flag is sort of an obvious one, but particularly the Confederate flag in Appalachia. Right. One historian of the Civil War has argued that keeping Confederate soldiers' wives loyal, particularly in poorer farm country, was a crucial goal of the Confederacy as the war went on. Because, if anyone's seen the movie Cold Mountain, or there's a novel that it's based on, soldiers would desert the Confederate Army to go home to starving families. When they would write and say, come home, we are starving. And so that is how the Confederate Army and Confederate government created a welfare program for soldiers' wives, because it was a cause. And so keeping those women loyal was really important. And that was mostly in these Appalachian areas, right? North Carolina had more men serving in the Confederacy than anywhere else, not often by choice, but often by force. I mean, I think that the symbols have a powerful life of their own. The Confederate flag is a prime example there. You see that in my own sort of Appalachian world. I'm on the edge of the mountains in Greenville, South Carolina. And whether I want to drive directly north into Asheville, North Carolina, or sort of northeast to Charlotte, which I did yesterday to catch a plane, you pass massive Confederate flags on the sides of highways, erected, not by accident, right, but erected recently. In South Carolina, I moved the summer that the Confederate flag went down. I moved into my current house while then President Obama was eulogizing Clementa Pinckney in Charleston. I listened to it on the radio because we didn't have a TV at that point set up. And in the weeks that followed, my first semester of teaching, as I would commute through a small town, I live a little ways from Clemson so that I can have a life when there's a football game and not get stuck at home. Or I guess tailgate every day. There were so many Confederate flags in the back of pickup trucks, put up there on a 6-foot flagpole in response to what had happened. And I was just thinking, where have I just moved? Like, what's happening? But to see how the flag resurfaced in those instances in direct response to recent action. Those flags were not up for anything other than what then Governor Nikki Haley had done at the State House. And to realize that those symbols are redeployed in all kinds of different ways, I think is really key.
Other questions? Scott?
I'm curious if studying the way Christians read and misread, or just read the Bible in very different ways in the 19th century, changed or challenged the way you read the Bible. And I don't say that presuming to know how you read the Bible now or used to.
I'm going to answer your question backwards, if that's okay. And the question I'm going to answer, and you'll see why it answers this, I hope, is how did I know that pro-slavery theology did not disappear with emancipation? And the reason, that's not your question, I'm gonna get back to your question. The reason that's the question I want to answer is because when I was in college, I first was reading anti-slavery. There's some amazing women, the Grimke sisters. I was like 19 and did a research paper on them, these white South Carolina women. The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd is a great sort of historical fiction account of them. These two sisters from South Carolina left their slaveholding family and became anti-slavery feminists in the North. So I was reading them, and so then I wanted to read what they were writing against, which was the pro-slavery side. And it was that argument I've just said, where we're the ones taking the Bible seriously against all these new cultural ideas. We're the ones holding fast to the text against these new cultural liberal ideas. And I thought, this sounds familiar. Right, not the slavery piece, but the rest of it. I thought, this seems like these ideas got recycled. Because if you'd taken abolitionism out as the evil and you'd slotted in any number of options, feminism, that would have been the big one when I was a teenager, for me. It would have been the same argument, right? We're the ones taking the Bible seriously against all these newfangled ideas. So, in a backwards way, I figured that people and the historians who cared about theology tended to say at that point that these ideas disappeared with emancipation. There's a book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis that says exactly that. It's wrong. But for me, what that showed me was how important it is to listen to people who are closer to the pain, the closest to the pain even, than the people with privilege. You don't need the white folks discussing whether slavery in the Roman Empire is like slavery in the antebellum South. You need to read the voices of enslaved people and formerly enslaved people. Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave, who became a huge advocate for African American civil and political rights. He wrote a memoir in about 1840, and he said in it, between the Christianity of this land, meaning America, and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference. So much so that to love the one means you must hate the other. He said, I love the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the partial, cradle-plundering, woman-whipping Christianity of this land. Indeed, he says that you can't even call this Christianity Christianity. So for me, the lesson is to get close to people in pain. I'm a straight white woman with all kinds of education, all their privilege. I don't need to be the one making decisions about what the Bible says about questions of gender identity and sexual orientation. I want to listen to my friends, and I have some great Greenville Christian friends who are lesbian, who talk to me. I was speaking at my church in Greenville, and I was trying to make discussions of LGBTQ safety in the 60s and 70s like a metaphorical safety or a kind of job safety. And these two women, Cindy and Pam, were sitting in the middle of the room. They've been together for almost 4 decades. They've been married for about a decade, I guess. And they were shaking their heads, no. No, this is not metaphorical safety. And I came up to them. I said, okay, sit, y'all talk, not me. And they talked about what it was like, and they told me both more than they wanted to say into a mic in a large church gathering, although they probably would say it into the mic too, about what it was like for them to fear for their safety in the South in previous decades. Right? It's not my place to say what that was like. And if I do start to say that, I want to look at that shaking head and say, okay, well, I'm stopping, you talk. Because I think that whether we call it theology from the margins or, any of these, this language would ever get like womanist theology, right? Listening to voices that have been excluded, listening to voices closer to the pain is so much better than anyone with privilege sitting there and saying what their take is on the Bible. So Scott, I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Very good. That brings us back to Susan Graber to bringing your voice about and encouraging you to look who's not being heard, who is in the story, where are the women? And we're so glad that she propelled you on this journey that's led you here. Let's thank Elizabeth Jemison for joining us tonight. And a reminder that her book is available at the book table just outside the door in the hallway, and a good chance to visit with Elizabeth and others. And also a book on IDB Wells by Catherine Meeks, one of our speakers, is available there as well, along with books by many of our speakers. And tomorrow Elizabeth will be with us to preach at noon. We so look forward to that, and hope you'll be there tomorrow, and look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for joining us tonight.